Well, we'll get started now. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to CRI's webinar on best practices in container deposit laws. My name is Susan Collins, and I'm the president of the Container Recycling Institute. And I'm going to turn things over in a second to Mike Samaha. Mike is the Director of Government Affairs at Owens, Illinois, and he's chair of the Board of Directors of the Container Recycling Institute. Mike, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Susan. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening across the globe, and welcome to the Container Recycling Institute's Best Practices in Container Deposit Laws event. As Susan said, my name is Mike Samaha. It is my honor to welcome those of you across the globe watching the live stream. For those of you who are not familiar with CRI, the Institute was founded in 1991. And its mission is to make North America a global model for the collection and quality recycling of packaging materials. Based on science and data, we believe that container deposit laws are the best way to achieve this, and the overwhelming interest in today's topic is proof that momentum is building. CRI is a 501c3 nonprofit, and if you like what you hear today, please consider making a contribution to support our research and education efforts. You can do so by visiting www.container-recycling.org and clicking on the donate button. On behalf of CRI's Board of Directors, I want to thank Susan Collins, Bonnie Seeberger, and Karen Hillsberg for all their time and efforts in putting this program on. And I want to thank all of our sponsors who have dedicated their time to be with us today. Finally, a huge thank you to Refold for their financial support that is allowing us to live stream this across the globe. Thank you all and welcome. And with that, I turn it back to Susan.
Mike, thank you so much for those warm remarks. I too want to give a special thank you to the speakers and the CRI staff and share with you something that happened behind the scenes this week. Due to the coronavirus, in the last 7 or 8 days, we have replanned and replanned this event twice over. All of the arrangements that we made over the last couple of months were completely changed. All of our travel plans were changed. Speakers had to cancel, and then we reformulated this as a webinar. And because we reformulated it, we were able to get 100% of our speakers back. And our speakers have gone through all of this with us, and I can't thank them enough. Everybody has been really terrific and pulled together. So thank you all so much. I'm going to introduce our first speaker now, and the speaker introductions that I will give will be brief because we have the speaker biographies as a separate document up on the CRI website. So we'll start with introducing Clarissa. She is the co-founder and CEO of Reloop Platform, which is an international not-for-profit association comprised of industry, NGOs, and cities that collectively support policy to further a circular economy. Reloop collaborates using value chain networks that provide technical and analytical expertise to help better define, communicate, and deploy waste minimization policies and operations. And many of you know Clarissa from her work in Canada, but she is now living in Barcelona, and she joins us from Barcelona. So good evening, Clarissa.
Good evening, Susan, and hello, everybody. I am indeed in Barcelona in quarantine with a mildly sick child upstairs. So looking forward to hanging with the family for 14 days. Interesting times. I want to thank you, Susan, for doing the big rearrange, and I think it speaks to the fact that we're perhaps moving into an era where we're going to be doing a lot more video conferencing, which is frankly great for the climate and good for families. So congratulations on pulling this off, and I will get right into my presentation. So as many of you know, I've been in Europe for the last 5 years, and there's been tremendous policy movement which has been fairly well received, amazingly enough. And what I'd like to do today is to walk you through one of the most interesting pieces of policy that's come in quite quickly. And as I'm presenting it to you, I want to try to present it in a way that you can think about it and how it could apply potentially in both Canada and America. So without further ado, I'm going to talk to you a little bit right now over the next 15 minutes about the Single-Use Plastics Directive. It's definitely not a surprise, I guess, that something like this came politically up. We've seen many, many photographs of the plastic waste problem in oceans. Next. I'm just going to say next, right, Susan? Yeah. This is just a typical sort of array of photos that are making people extremely emotional about the issue of plastic packaging and plastics in the ocean. Next, please. It really culminated, oh, and again, great. It really culminated with this. This was a project that was done by Break Free from Plastic. Some of you might have seen it, where they, I think it's now the second year where they do litter composition analyses on beaches, and then they do it by brand, and they publish the worst brand offenders. This actually came out while they were negotiating the Single-Use Plastics Directive. So it certainly, I think, politically pushed it over the edge, where it became a really emotional issue, where politicians, I think, were quite furious with the industry and basically created this directive, which is very much going to be an impact on the industry. Next, please. So what are we talking about? We're talking about this guy named Frans Timmermans, and he was the vice president of the European Commission. He is now the head of the new Green Deal Commission, which is really one of the most powerful parts of the new European Commission. There's a whole new slate of individuals running the organization. And he came up with this. So in other words, he's still in power. So there is not going to be a disconnect in terms of his ultimate vision. He came out in May of 2018. The commission basically tabled a piece of legislation. And just like in America, where you have sort of the three houses, in the European Union, you have a bureaucratic administrative body called the European Commission, and then you have the Parliament, and then you have the Council. The Parliament is like the Congress. We have a lot of members from different political parties from different countries in the European Union. And then you have the Council, which is more like the Senate, where in this case you have one seat per member state. So it's a total of 28. And ultimately what happens is the three parts of government have to come together and negotiate a piece of legislation. And the amazing thing about this Single-Use Plastics Directive was it was negotiated within less than 8 months. That is unprecedented in Europe. And again, it speaks to the fact that this was very much supported by the vast majority of all of those at the European Commission. And then the final actual publishing took place in July 2019. So this directive, when I'm talking about it, you have to understand it is fully underway right now. So let's get into it. Next, please. So I'm just going to pull out the most important pieces of the directive. Suffice to say, it's not a long directive. Of the articles from 1 to, I guess, 23, it's maybe like 7 or 8 pages, but I'm going to pull out the key things. So the first most important thing about this directive is that it bans products, single-use products from the marketplace by 2021. Now, when I say it bans, this means that a little bit like if you were to get a federal law in America, states would need to ultimately implement the obligations within that law, but usually have the opportunity to even make it more rigorous. And in the same way, the European passes this list of banned products, but ultimately allows for member states to include these mandatory products on their own banned list, but could potentially expand their banned list to include other single-use items. So here is the list. A lot of these are not a surprise. I'm sure many of you have heard about this. And then the most important thing to say is that the expanded polystyrene, interestingly enough, was added after the Commission released its draft. It was an initiative by the parliamentarians, and that got through, which is also kind of interesting. So in other words, it ended up being in many ways more ambitious than when it was originally written, which is also very rare. So here you have the list, and these definitions defining a plastic straw, defining a plastic balloon stick, are all going to be published in July of this year, 1 year following the publication of the directive. And it will be published in the form of an implementing act, and that implementing act is verbatim to be followed by by member states, and there's no wiggle room there. So in things like target calculations and definitions, it's pretty rigorous, and that will be published in July for any more specificities on this product list. The next item in the single-use directive is the extended producer responsibility. Now, many of you know that a lot of packaging is already under EPR obligation. It has been for many, many years in Europe. We're not talking about that. That's all within the packaging directive and the waste framework directive. Now, this new directive is putting EPR obligations onto other single-use products that aren't typically targeted, like wet wipes, like tobacco products with filters, because the filters have plastic, like cups for beverages, like balloons, like carrier bags. All of this means that, like other EPR programs, member states will have to develop national EPR programs to ensure that producers or first importers of these products will have to cover the costs of collection, transport, treatment, cleanup of litter. And that's the big new one, because normally litter cleanup costs are not included in EPR obligations, but in this particular case, for this product list, they are. So all this to say, a number of brand owners that are typically putting these products on the marketplace are going to be obligated to finance extended producer responsibility programs. And again, details around, for example, what constitutes a fair litter cleanup charge to be paid for by producers, those details are all going to be developed in the next 6 to 12 months, basically. Next item. So we have EPR, we have bans. This is my personal favorite. The Article 9 sets out a 77 by 2025 and a 90% by 2029 collection for recycling rate, or separate collection for recycling. And they also stipulate, this is for plastic beverage bottles with a capacity up to 3 liters, including caps and lids. Caps and lids are typically not the same material as PET, but they can be. But in other words, it's covering the whole bottle and its cap. And there is a suggestion that in order to achieve this target, these two targets, member states can implement deposit return or establish some other separate collection system under a relevant extended producer responsibility scheme. So what we're looking at is that a number of member states are going to move forward with deposit schemes. Some of them are going to attempt to meet 90% with their existing yellow bin or blue bag programs that they have, but there's definitely some pessimism in terms of whether or not that is actually achievable. And just so you understand, what does a 90% collection for recycling mean? The specificities of that calculation are only going to be published in July, but we are working very hard to ensure that it is a properly calculated rate, which excludes contaminants that are often calculated in with when you're calculating it based on weight, like you would with a yellow bin system, that those contaminants, non-targeted materials, everything from non-plastic beverage bottles, so for example, plastic salad dressing bottles, or plastic trays, or donut PET little boxes that you would get in the grocery store, or other non-beverage PET has to be factored out. How that's done will be elaborated soon, but that's very much a part of this calculation. So very aggressive target of 90%. Next. The final one, and you can click again so we can see them both. There's 2 key pieces in the product requirements. The first is that the cap or the lid will remain tethered or attached during the product's intended stage. So that's just one photograph of what it could look like. Specifications have not been drawn up yet, and there's definitely flexibility around it, but I would say that there is an interest by the Commission to ensure that there is design criteria to ensure that a bottle running through a reverse vending machine its tether will not screw things up. So that's sort of the only big consideration right now in terms of by 2024, we want to make sure that all those caps that are attached are not going to create problems down the line. And for those of you that are not aware about how PET bottles are recycled, having a cap attached to a bottle is typically not a problem because most bottles arrive with caps anyway in a deposit system, so they tend to be shredded by the PET recycler, and then through easy float sortation, they get scooped off the top and sent to polypropylene recycling markets. And then the other big one, which is I think the biggest one, is the mandatory 25% recycled content in our PET bottles by 2025 and 30% in all plastic beverage bottles by 2030. This is certainly the one that has been, I think, the most impactful in fundamentally shifting, at least in Europe, many of the brand owners' positions on deposit systems versus other collection systems. It is, I won't go through any names, but I can tell you that I've been in this business for 25 years. There's been a big wall of opposition to deposits, and that wall is starting to crumble. And one of the key players leaving is some of the biggest branded products, because they're recognizing that they'll never be able to meet their 25% rPET obligation unless they get a consistent clean stream of a lot of material coming through the collection system. And they know from experience that that has typically only been really done well in a deposit system. So this is a very big item. And I also want to say that this was not in the original draft from the Commission. It was also added by the Parliament at a later stage because they really felt it was an important message to send to producers that not only do we need to have collection targets, but we also have to sort of close the loop with it and put some pressure downstream on the producers to buy that product once it's collected. Next, please. So just before I move to the refillable presentation, I just want to show you this map of Europe. I told you things are changing. Everything in dark green are the programs that were already in place, deposit systems. There's about 10 out of 28 member states. All the light green stuff is all new. It's all happened in the last, say, year to a year and a half. And most of them are legislated with the exception of Scotland, but it's completely planned, and they actually released the draft legislation this morning for anyone on the call that wants to see it. It's out as of about an hour ago. And the one in red is England. They've certainly made a political decision, but we're not quite at the point where we can say it's definitely happening. But as you can see, the map of Europe has significantly changed. I believe that in the next 5 years, I think most of it will be light green or dark green because things are really starting to change out here in Europe. So I think I'm going to end there with this presentation. I think that's my last slide. Yes. Okay. Now I'm going to do a quick switch to refillables. And Susan's asked me to quickly touch on the study that was done by Oceana, but also I wanted to talk a bit about a report on refillables that's coming out of Reloop. So next, please. So the first thing I wanted to put up, this is from the Oceana study. Oceana is an environmental organization focusing on clean oceans. They did a study on refillables to try to get an understanding of what would the impact be if we switched from single-use containers into refillables, and what would that exponentially mean in terms of a reduction of single-use containers and therefore a reduction of marine debris. Now, I don't have all the assumptions they made, and I think it's fair to say that it's very difficult to extrapolate from sales data how much is going to end up in the marine environment, but for what it's worth, they attempted to do it to just sort of point out what a massive impact refillables can have to ultimately prevent single-use containers from entering the market, let alone entering the marine environment. So this is a slide that shows you status quo versus an increase in refillables and what it will mean in terms of a reduction in marine litter. So you can look at this study online and you can look at this in closer detail, but certainly there is a significant amount of tonnage that could be reduced by simply moving to refillable bottles. Next, please. Also in their study, they do highlight a couple of life cycle assessments that were done, one in Germany and another one by their own consulting team, which shows that glass refillable bottles, despite weighing more, tend to have the lowest environmental impact in terms of waste, water consumption, and energy input. So without getting into more detail about the life cycle assessment, I will tell you that one of the things that Reloop is going to be coming out with hopefully soon, hopefully in a collaboration with Zero Waste Europe, is a meta-analysis of a number of different environmental LCAs on refillables to better understand what are the defining variables that are going to impact that life cycle assessment. Next, please. And this study has actually already touched on 4. These are the 4 sort of key things that impact the environmental net balance. The first is the obvious one, which is trippage rates, how many times that bottle makes it around till it's out of circulation. I know that when I'm in Germany and I'm drinking out of a plastic refillable mineral water bottle of 1 liter, and I look at the markings that they put on that bottle every time it gets washed, I've seen on average about 9 for plastic mineral water bottles. And I've been told by my colleagues in Germany that for the glass bottles, they're significantly higher. So even 9 is a pretty good trip rate. Then of course, routes for waste collection, which is ultimately another way of saying, how well are you collecting the material? What is your collection rate? So in terms of refillables, we want to have an extremely high collection rate, like upwards of 95 plus, to get all those valuable multi-use bottles back. The third one is the distribution system. This is really about logistics and transport and trucks on the road and ensuring that there's not too much distances between the refilling line and the collection line. And the final one is what they call material transformation and handling processes, which get into all of the energy that goes into that beginning to end process, washing, and other functions that have to take place within a refillable system. So these are sort of the 4 key variables. There's probably a couple more, but this study has certainly identified them. Next, please. So now I just want to turn to Reloop and what you can expect from Reloop. We have purchased the global data, which is one of the biggest sales databases existing in the world. We have a project where we're going to be releasing data for 93 countries. And ultimately, our project was intended to inform the reader about the potential for refillable containers and reduce overall packaging footprint of beverage packaging, to discuss the overall trend of declining refillables around the world and see if this is likely to continue, and then to provide some recommendations on ways to reduce or even reverse this decline trend. So the first thing is to take a look globally, what we're looking at. Globally, single use versus refill, about 80% of containers on a unit basis are in single use versus 20% in refill across the globe. Next slide, please. When our study that looked at 93 countries looks at these 5 beverage types: water, carbonates, beer, cider, juice, nectar, stills, and sports and energy drinks. Next slide, please. And here are some really interesting findings. So the first thing you need to know is we have listed this chart here in the biggest declines in refillable market share over a 20-year period, indicated in the last column in descending order. So of the 93 countries we looked at, 48 had an overall refillable market share of 20% or more. So very small market shares across the board. But in all but 2 of the 48, those market shares are on the decline. So massive decline over time. And you can see here the market share in 1999 versus the market share in 2018 and the huge declines that have occurred. Now, they've all occurred for very different reasons, and that's a whole other discussion. In Denmark and Finland, for example, it was really because of the elimination of a tax on single-use packaging, and that's what resulted in the switch. But every country has its own situation, including, I don't know if Venezuela's on here, but recently Venezuela, the market share went up simply because nobody has any money. So it's the cheapest is to buy refillable bottles. Next slide, please. So the next slide tells you that this is when you look at refillables by population and who's buying the most refillables, you'll find that 85% of the world's refillables are actually just sold in 20 countries. And these are the 20 countries in descending order, the highest being, of course, China, and then followed by the famous German refillables, where you have about 26 billion units sold per year. So this is just interesting for your information to see those declining market shares and where the bulk of the containers are purchased. And I would just say that, and this is sort of what the Oceana report did, was, you know, countries like India, like looking at the top of the list, Mexico, India, Brazil, Philippines, Colombia, we're talking about, you know, 17 billion, 12 billion, with massive declines over the years. These are typically really good refillable glass bottles that are being pushed out of the market and being replaced typically with one-way single PET bottles, where we don't have in these countries the proper waste management system to collect them. So it's one thing to talk about a declining refillable rate in a developed country like Belgium or Germany, where you do have a yellow bin system to capture those single-use containers. It's quite something else when you're dealing with a developing country, where you just, this is an exponential problem that could keep getting bigger, in fact. Next slide, please. Just to show you the correlation between high use of refillables and more impoverished countries, this dot map shows you on the far left, you have poverty rank of close to 1. So the poorer countries on the left and the richer countries on the right. And then as you go up the scale, you see which ones are having a higher market share for refillables. That funny dot in the top right corner is, of course, Germany, where it is definitely an outliner. But you can see there's a trend here, that there's a correlation between a country's wealth as measured by GDP and their dependence on refillables. A poor country is more likely to have a high market share, and a wealthy country is more likely to have a lower share. In America, even when we started our research in 1999, the market share was already well below 20%. Again, speaks to the wealth of the country. Next, please. So this is what you can expect from us probably in the next 6 weeks. You'll have access via our website to scroll across the globe and to pull out charts like this that show you what the sales look like by container types over 20 years, by beverage type. So you can really see what's going on in the marketplace. And it will better sort of help inform policy as we move forward. So this is something to look forward to, and hopefully it will provide more transparency on this topic. Next, please. I'll just end with that. I think I'm right on time. Yes. I'll just say that part of our study is not only these charts, but we also have identified a number of policy moves that a government can make to help re-stimulate or reverse that declining trend. One of the top things on the list is a deposit system on all beverage containers, not just refillables. Legislating a deposit on refillables is kind of crazy, because if you want a refillable system, you're going to introduce your own deposit system anyway. You don't need to legislate that. But legislating it on single-use containers is important, because you're providing a level playing field for the consumer. You're giving the consumer the ability to not have to pay a deposit on a refillable when they don't have to pay a deposit on a non-refillable. So that sort of leveling the playing field between single-use and multi-use is one of the first steps on giving a chance to refillables to survive or to experience growth. And this is a time where governments really do want to stimulate refillables. We're seeing already new quotas being set. Romania has set a quota for refillables, a 5% increase year over year. And in France, in fact, they just passed a law that is calling for a 50% reduction of single-use plastic beverage bottles, which they want to be partially picked up by refillable bottles. So there is a real interest after all these years in refillables, and I really hope that Reloop can work together with American partners, in particular some of the material industries that stand to benefit from putting out a great refillable bottle that can experience many trips and many washes, because I think there's a fantastic opportunity here. So I'm going to stop and happy to answer any questions or whatever you tell me to do, Susan. Thank you.
Clarissa, thank you so much, so much. Thank you for all of the changes that you have had to make this week to your travel plans. We were all supposed to be together making these presentations in Berkeley, California, but we've had to upend everything this week. And thank you for presenting from Barcelona. And the sound quality was great. Thank you.
Fantastic, thanks.
Well, next, I'm going to give the presentation that was supposed to be the introduction. We changed the order of things so that Clarissa wouldn't have to make a presentation after midnight in Barcelona. So now we're going to go into the introduction to the day. And again, if you're not familiar with my voice, I'm Susan Collins. I am the president of the Container Recycling Institute, and the speaker biographies are in a document on our website. The agenda is also in a document on our website. I'm throwing those things in for anyone who might have joined late and didn't hear that. Another thing I want to mention is that we may not have very much time for questions and answers. Amazingly, all of our speakers, after all of the travel arrangements were upended, everybody was able to rejoin. So we have an absolutely packed day today, and we're just going to try to get through these presentations and focus on that more than the questions and answers. So here we go. This is the slide that I start every presentation with because this is so incredibly important. And for me, when I learned this information, it was an epiphany and it changed my entire way of thinking about the work that I do. The old way of looking at greenhouse gas emissions, the old way of doing the inventory country by country, looked at a sector-based approach. So the old way looked at the transportation sector and the housing sector and the utilities that were producing greenhouse gases, and it assigned all of the greenhouse gases to those sectors. But then about 10 years ago, some really smart people came along and they asked some really smart questions, and they said, well, if there's a utility sector, what is it producing energy for? And if there's a transportation sector and we have huge trucks driving all across the country, why are those huge trucks driving around? What's in those trucks? And so it decided to take this, what they call consumption view, a completely different view of our greenhouse gas inventory. And these are the results in this slide. And the thing that was so groundbreaking about this was that it turns out that the biggest contributor to our greenhouse gas production is our stuff. You see the two big red slices at the bottom there. It's the provision of goods and the use of goods. And so what that means, provision of goods means the manufacture of the item and everything it takes to get it to your door. And the use of goods is something like if you have an iPhone and you plug it in during the use phase, it's going to use energy and therefore produce greenhouse gases. So it turns out that our stuff is the reason that we produce as much greenhouse gases as we do. It's 44% in products and packaging. That's almost half of everything. So if that's the biggest piece and a really important piece, what can we do to reduce the greenhouse gas production from our products and packaging? And recycling is a really important and powerful answer, because when we recycle, we reduce a tremendous amount of the upstream production of greenhouse gas emissions, of toxics, of energy. So that is where we really fulfill the promise of recycling, is when we can use it to get recycled content into our goods and reduce all of those emissions and greenhouse gases. So that's why I start every presentation with that. It's the single most important thing for us to know about recycling. It is the purpose of recycling. I also want to take a minute to make another note, because I imagine that like me, a lot of you have been reflecting on things that you hadn't reflected on. This last week has been so crazy as we have made so many changes to adjust for coronavirus. Coronavirus is something that is absolutely immediate. It's something that the people all over the world are having a lot of fear about, and it's a real risk. We know it's a real risk, and we're acting in accordance with that. We don't do the same thing in general, or we don't do enough of it when it comes to climate change. Climate change is a real risk and will be far more catastrophic. So I've been reflecting on that this week. What will it take for us to truly have the courage to face the changes we need to make when it comes to climate change? So that was a special message just for this week. So we have seen something really extraordinary happen in the world with respect to existing and new container deposit laws. So I'm going to tell you what the story of this chart is. This story starts in 1970 when British Columbia passed the first container deposit law, and it goes up through the present time and a little beyond. In the first 47 years of having container deposit laws, they grew to cover 300 million people. And then something extraordinary started to happen in the last few years. And in the last 3 years, new deposit laws have been announced that would cover another 300 million people. So I'll say that again. In 47 years, container deposit laws grew to the point that they covered 300 million people. And then in 3 years, they grew so much that they will cover another 300 million people. That's a doubling of container deposit laws in a 3-year period. And in my entire career in recycling, I've never seen a change that drastic. So this is what it looks like. Clarissa already talked about a lot of the changes that are happening in the European Union, but they're also happening all over the world, from New Zealand to Maharashtra, India to Turkey, just all over the place. More and more container deposit laws are being passed. This is what Australia looked like a little bit ago, but we need to update this map because Victoria and Tasmania have also passed container deposit laws that will be implemented soon. So the entire country will be covered with container deposit laws now. And Clarissa did show that map from the EU as well. So again, this is the introduction session. So why beverage containers? One, they're consumed on the go. It's hard to capture all the beverage containers in households because at least 1/3 of all drinks sold are consumed away from home. They also consume large amounts of energy in manufacturing. They contribute to greenhouse gases, and they comprise a significant volume in the waste stream, and it's very much growing. And they also, there's the litter issue. At least 14% of litter is from beverage containers. So we did this art project a couple of years ago to show people what one person's consumption of beverage containers looks like every year. It's just about 840 containers for every US person. Every man, woman, and child on average in the United States produces this huge, huge pile of beverage containers every year. And this art project was done with a representative amount of containers by material type and by beverage type. So it's just the right amount of milk containers versus wine containers, etc. And a lot of this growth is from PET plastic water bottles. Over this 21-year period that's depicted here, water bottle sales have grown 25 times. That's the factor from 2.8 billion in 1996 to 70 billion in 2017. And yes, we measure beverage containers in terms of billions. So these are all US plastic bottled water sales. And we also know, and we've known for decades, that curbside recycling won't take care of this problem. The data shows that as curbside recycling access has grown, Ironically, beverage container recycling has fallen over this 40-year time period. So the benefits of container deposit systems are, these first three are the key, most well-known benefits, where they're just, we call them the rock stars of recycling because the difference is so dramatic. They produce very high recycling rates. We say, if you're not getting 80%, you're not doing it right. They produce clean recycled materials for manufacturing. They reduce litter tremendously, and we've got a couple of slides on that. They also shift the end-of-life costs for used beverage containers to the producers. And of course, they conserve energy, greenhouse gases, and natural resources, and they create jobs. So here are return rates. Thank you, Clarissa, for this slide. Return rates in 38 deposit jurisdictions around the world. The median rate is 82%. So again, if you're not, if your deposit program isn't getting at least 80% as a redemption rate, it probably needs to be adjusted and updated. In the United States, deposits drive up the overall US beverage container recycling rate. In other words, our recycling rate in the United States isn't too great for beverage containers, but it would be god-awful if it wasn't for these 10 deposit states. Nearly half of all the beverage containers recycled in the US come from these 10 bottle bill states, even though they only have 28% of the US population. And even though some of these deposit laws are what I call half a deposit law, they only cover half of the beverages. So this chart shows us US recycling rates by deposit status. So on the left, those are deposit containers. Those are the containers on deposit. It's not the states, it's whether or not the containers have a deposit on them. That's the way we've sliced up the data here. And then on the right is the non-deposit containers. And we just chose the three big material types: aluminum, PET, and glass. So when you have containers on deposit, the redemption rate or the recycling rate is 2 to 4 times as high as if you don't have them on deposit. And then, because the deposit program, the reason it works is because it's an incentive. Of course, the stronger the incentive, the stronger the effect. So for the US states in 2018, the 5 states on the left in blue have a straight 5-cent across the board deposit value. And on the right, there are some states that have a mixed deposit value. Like in California, the small containers have a 5-cent deposit and the large containers have a 10-cent deposit. In Oregon and Michigan, the 2 states that are shown in orange, those 2 states have a 10-cent deposit across the board, and they have 2 of the highest redemption rates in the country. I'm just going to briefly touch on the quality issue. These 2 photos were taken at a glass processing facility. These 2 piles were, separated by maybe 40 feet. So they were at the same facility. The photos were taken on the same day. The pile on the left is containers from a container deposit law, and you can see that it's big bottles of glass. It's recognizable as glass. The pile on the right, the first time I saw it, I thought that pile was their residual pile, but it turned out that was a load that had been dropped off from a material recovery facility here in Southern California. And to be fair, the glass and plastic do tend to float to the top of the load when it's in transit, going through transportation. So it looks like there's more paper and plastic here than there really is. There's an awful lot of glass underneath that. But it gives you an idea of how difficult it must be to clean the glass out of that pile and make sure that it's glass, that it's a high enough quality that it can go into a manufacturing process. To touch on the energy impacts, again, beverage container recycling is often trivialized, but it is not trivial, not at all. If we recycled all of our beverage containers in the United States, instead of throwing them out, in total, we could save enough energy to power about 2.3 million American homes. I've got a couple slides here on the litter issue. You probably can't see the names of these states at the bottom of the page, but just know that they're Great Lakes states, and only one of these Great Lakes states has a container deposit law, which is Michigan on the right. And Michigan has about half of the beverage container litter of the other states that don't have a deposit law. In fact, this group in Australia did a study and published it in Marine Policy. And the study showed that beverage container deposit laws, on average, reduced beverage container litter by 40% across all of the states and nations that they looked at. Here, I'm just going to introduce the fact that completes the introduction. I'm just going to introduce the fact that we do have a new project that we're working on here at Container Recycling Institute, and our Business Advisory Council is doing their advisory work and helping us with that project. And it's to look at guiding principles and key elements of container deposit laws. And what we hope to do is produce a guidebook for new places that are looking at implementing a container deposit law, to give them some guidance. So with that, that concludes my introductory presentation. And I am going to now introduce Sarah Edwards. Sarah Edwards is the CEO of Eunomia Research and Consulting in North America, and she has 20 years of experience in the waste and resource management sector, working across the public, private, and consultancy sectors in North America, the UK, and Africa. And I know she's got a little bit of introduction in her presentation to tell you a little more about Eunomia. So with that, I will turn it over to Sarah. Hello, Sarah.
Hello, Susan. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you loud and clear.
Wonderful, thank you. Despite my accent, I'm actually coming from a very eerily quiet New York City. There's nobody in the office at all apart from myself. So yeah, we're really pleased to be obviously presenting on this, really important webinar. And Susan's asked me to talk about a really important issue around that's often seen as kind of a hindrance almost to deposit systems, and that's looking at what is the impact of a deposit system on existing municipality services, and specifically in terms of the viability and the cost of those services. So next slide, please. So over the next 15 minutes, I'm just going to give you a very quick overview of Eunomia, and I think why Susan and CRI asked us to speak. And they're going to just kind of touch on the principles of a circular economy. What we do know is obviously our current recycling sector was based on the old reduce, reuse, recycle, and divert waste from landfill, a very kind of end of pipe solution system. And as we move forward, we're looking at kind of how we can design our systems for a circular economy, and that includes some of the things around material quality that Susan's touched on, and also moving to refillables that Clarissa's touched on. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about what is the opposition from municipalities and haulers to deposit systems and the impact they may have on their services, and then looking a little bit more detail about what the real systems impacts are, and not necessarily just the perceived impacts. And then I'm going to touch on a few examples and then some key takeaways. Next slide, please. So Eunomia has been working on deposits probably for over 10 years now, and came to it really looking at what to try and address litter impacts. And here are some of the systems that we've been working on. So in North America, we've been looking at how to modernize Vermont's current deposit system, which I'll touch on a little bit later. We've looked at reviewing the California system. We've designed a blueprint for a modern deposit system for Ontario. And also across in Europe, we've been instrumental on some of the key changes that Clarissa touched on in terms of systems that may come into place in Scotland, in England. We've worked on a program for the Czech Republic. And Eunomia's real key expertise really is looking at the cost benefit of changes in our recycling and resource management systems. So next slide, please. So first of all, as I just touched on, our current curbside single stream recycling services was really predominantly based on an end of pipe solution system. And what we're looking at now is the principles of the circular economy. So how can we design waste out of the process at the very start? How can we keep materials and products in use for as long as possible? And how can we have a regenerative natural system? And really, when we're looking at the future of waste management and resource management in the US and across the globe, we should be thinking about how are we going to achieve these principles of this circular economy. And from our point of view, and as the evidence suggests, a container deposit can do this. It effectively allows for upwards of 90% recycling of beverage containers that are within the system. It maintains the quality, as Susan touched on, so that we can have closed loop recycling, so bottles can go back into bottles, and it supports a refillable model. And you know, what we do know actually is some of the existing or current deposit systems were built off the back of a refillable model, and although there has been a decline, there is now increasingly more recognition of the role that refillables can play, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that later today from Jules in Oregon. Next slide. So what is the opposition really from a municipality and a hauler perspective? So when deposit systems are introduced, either if that may be in a new state or if the scope of containers in an existing state is looking to become more inclusive of all beverages, there is a material loss at the curbside. So materials will move from the curbside existing programs into the deposit system. And associated with this material loss, there's obviously a revenue loss. So when PET materials, aluminium moves from that blue box curbside program into a deposit program, then the value of that material reduces. In addition, however, you know, we know that there's a movement of aluminium PET, there's also movement of glass, and glass collected generally in a single stream process, curbside service, has little or no value, whereas under deposit system, it has a specific value. So when there is a material loss, there's also potentially an increase in cost for those municipality services because they don't have the same level of revenue to offset the cost of services. And in some instances, this may propose a service level risk. But what we have to remember is that when a deposit system is implemented, material is not lost only from the curbside recycling services. It's also predominantly lost from the trash. So as Susan highlighted earlier, recycling of beverage containers through curbside single stream material services is typically around 30%. So effectively, the majority of material that would be collected when a deposit system is introduced will come from the trash stream and not from the existing curbside systems. Also, this kind of opposition statement looks only at the system goal, not effectively of how to meet a circular economy in a new system, but effectively helping to maintain the current curbside services. And it doesn't consider that absolutely wider environmental impact or the greenhouse gas impact that Susan has already spoken about. Next slide, please. So when we're looking at what the real financial impact is, we need to look at, there is a material loss and there may be a material revenue loss for those curbside services. But as I just mentioned, predominantly material when a new or expanded deposit system is implemented will actually move from the trash stream. So it will be additional material diverted from landfill. In addition to those landfill disposal cost savings, there'll be glass processing savings. As I just said, curbside glass collected at the curbside generally has a cost to the MRF or the municipality for managing that glass. That is not so under deposit system. A municipality, in theory, if they are collecting less material at the curbside, will pay a less reduced MRF tipping fee because they effectively be tipping less material at the MRF. When material also moves through from the curbside system, whether that's a curbside recycling system or a curbside trash collection, there is the opportunity when the scale is correct to make some collection efficiencies. So effectively allowing some savings to be made on your collection services. In addition to this, there's obviously the additional savings that will be represented by a reduction in litter, and deposit systems have demonstrated to be shown to reduce beverage-related litter by up to 90%. Next slide. So in addition to those financial impacts, there's also obviously the environmental impacts, which I won't go into too much. But although there's a material loss at the curbside recycling system, overall more material is recycled. So overall more material can be fed back into that closed loop recycling process. There's also the increase in quality compared to that material collected at the single stream. There's a reduction in litter, and there's the associated greenhouse gas emissions of basically replacing virgin material with secondary material, allowing that closed loop recycling, and a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from the disposal of material. Next slide. So the next few slides, I'm just going to give you a little bit of an example of how we've modelled these changes in 3 different areas. So the first one, this infographic is from my colleagues' work in the UK. So this was a piece of work we did looking at what would be the impact on municipalities of implemented a deposit system in England, where there is currently no deposit system. So as I said here, previously, there is the opportunity for collection savings at the curbside. When material moves out of the curbside system, there is less volume and tonnage to be collected. So in theory, there could be a modelled collection system saving. Here we modelled it as £1.65, which is equivalent of effectively $2 per year per household, which is 17 cents per household per year. In addition to those collection savings, there's sorting savings, so that's your MRF processing costs. As I said, a reduction in material collected means there's a reduction in material processed, which can provide an additional saving to municipalities, so long as that MRF operator does not pass on additional costs to the municipality. So in addition to those potential savings, there's obviously the material revenue loss that we spoke about. And then, but most importantly, there is a reduction in the amount of material going to landfill or energy from waste, depending on where material ends up. And that can provide a significant savings in the region here in the UK of up to £4.55, equivalent of $5.56. And in addition to that, you've got savings on your street cleansing, reduction in litter, providing an overall estimated savings on the system by having both a curbside system and a deposit system of £1.47, which is about $1.80 per household. So this basically shows you that it's not just about material revenue loss. There's significant savings that can be found across the recycling and collection system to offset this material revenue loss. Next slide. We were recently appointed by VPO to look at what would be the impact of expanding Vermont's current bottle bill. So the current system has a 5-cent deposit. They wanted to look at what the impact of moving to a 10-cent deposit would be. Their scope was currently just carbonated soft drinks, beers and spirits, and they wanted to understand what the impact would be of adding other materials, specifically water. So you can see there in the middle, only 54% of total beverage containers in the system or placed on the market are actually covered by the existing deposit system. So they wanted to look at what would the impact of adding the further 46% of containers in there, and what would be the impact of the redemption rate going from the current 75% up to 90%, which we know can be achieved based on experience in other states of a 10-cent deposit. So we wanted to look at what the impact specifically on MRF operators, haulers, and ultimately the household would be of this future system. Next slide, please. So the diagram in the top left-hand side, I hope you can all see that, but this shows you the material that effectively would be drawn from the curbside recycling versus that which would be pulled from the curbside trash system. So at the bottom, you can see there's about just over 5,000 tons of material that would move from the curbside into the deposit system, but overwhelmingly more material and therefore cost savings would be drawn from your trash system and effectively from the landfill site. So you're in this, under just Vermont's expanding of their current bottle bill, over 15,000 tons of material, equivalent in weight of 10,200 cars, would be recycled just from making these changes. On the bottom left, hopefully you can see that, but the blue bar on the left-hand side shows you the revenue loss effectively that municipalities or MRF operators would face from this 5,000 tons of material moving from the curbside into the deposit system. The red bar there shows the loss of tipping fees. So if I was a MRF operator and that 5,000 tons moved was removed from my material coming into my MRF, I'd have that red bar loss in tipping fees. But those losses are overwhelmingly compensated for by savings in disposal costs. So the purple bar there shows the savings that would be resulting from not sending that 15,000 tons of material to landfill, but capturing that in the deposit system. In addition to that, there'll be revenue from the unclaimed deposits that will go into Vermont's environmental fund. So resulting in an overarchingly large whole system benefit of over $2 million of financial benefit resulting from implementing or expanding the deposit system in Vermont to include a larger scope of materials and an increase in deposit. If this is transferred back onto the household, effectively, not only do we have that increase in recycling rate, we have a significant reduction in CO2, greenhouse gas emissions, and an overall saving per month to households of $22. So despite there being a loss of revenue and material moving from the curbside, the system overall performs significantly better and could, in theory, pass through a saving to the household. Next slide, please. And then finally, we did a piece of work for Ontario. So Ontario has probably one of the most established blue box or curbside recycling programs, and at the moment is achieving a very high recycling rate of 65% for its packaging and paper products. Currently in Ontario, the blue box program there is paid for 50% by producers and 50% by municipalities, and that's effectively over the next few years going to be changed to a full EPR model. So what we wanted to do is look at what would be the impact in terms of meeting a program goal of 75% recycling rate for packaging and paper, of implementing a curbside program, a deposit program for non-alcoholic beverages, because they already have an existing deposit system for their alcoholic beverages. Next slide, please. So what we did here is we looked at modeling what would be the benefit of the curbside collection costs of material moving from the curbside into a deposit system for non-alcoholic beverages. And you can see here on the table that effectively we modeled I spoke about before that there could be some collection efficiencies from moving material out. So we modeled a new curbside collection system, which was based on moving to a every other week collection service for trash and recycling, which was already in place for around 30% of households in Ontario. So this table here looks at the savings that could be achieved through optimizing your curbside collection system, blue box system, 29 million saving there, a Canadian dollar saving there. It looked at what the material revenue loss would be, which was the 2.2 million there, and also looked at what the residential collection costs and also disposal cost savings would be, overall providing a total curbside system reduction in cost of 47 million Canadian dollars. When we then added back into that the cost of implementing the deposit system, overall the system annually would save 12 million Canadian dollars per annum by implementing both systems alongside each other. There'd be a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, but most importantly, the recycling rate here would become much closer to their 75% goal. So moving from the current 65.8% recycling rate to a 73.9% recycling rate. And that's predominantly because the current recycling rate for non-alcoholic beverage containers under the program is just over 45%. So this was moving that effectively up to a 90% collection from recycling rate. Under this study, we also looked at what the social impacts would be, and there'd be an additional 800 jobs created. Next slide, please. So just quickly, the key takeaways. So when a deposit system is implemented, by far the majority of material moves from the trash or the disposal collection system into the deposit system. So the municipality reduction in disposal costs, landfill costs, significantly outweighs the material loss. The material movement also allows for potential curbside collection efficiencies due to reduced volume and tonnage, and most effectively, the system, when working alongside each other, support a circular economy. So it supports the curbside recycling system, is a cost-effective mechanism for achieving high diversion and recycling rates, which is what we want to try and do to ensure we get material into the circular economy, and it maintains that material use through closed loop recycling. Thank you. Sorry, I think I slightly overrun my time.
You know, Sarah, I think I did too, and it's all going to be great. So thank you very much, Sarah. And next, I'm going to introduce Scott Breen. Scott is the Vice President of Sustainability at the Can Manufacturers Institute, which represents U.S. can manufacturers and suppliers. His responsibilities include promoting food and beverage cans as the leading sustainable circular packaging, making sure federal and state policy support an efficient recycling system, and recognize the can's sustainability advantages. There's more to his biography, and all of the speaker biographies are available in a document that's on our website. So without further ado, I will introduce and turn it over to Scott. Welcome, Scott.
Thank you, Susan. Can you hear me?
You sound great.
Oh, okay, awesome. Everyone else sounded great too, so I'm glad I kept the streak going. So yes, I'm here to talk about the importance of deposits to aluminum beverage can recycling. So next slide, please. So the agenda for my talk, I want to review the impact of deposits on aluminum beverage can recycling. I then want to discuss the can industry's recycling vision and the impact of us achieving that vision. And then lastly, the evolution of the can industry's position on deposits. I joined the can industry in an exciting time, middle of last year, for several reasons. And certainly one of them is that we're taking a fresh look at deposits as part of increasing our recycling rate. So next slide. So this gives you a sense of our aluminum beverage can sustainability KPIs. I want to bring your attention to what's in the red box there. That's our consumer recycling rate. You can see we report that we recycle about half the aluminum beverage cans that we ship out. And to me, I'm pretty proud of this recycling rate because I think it's very legitimate, because it's not based on the volume of the weight of material collected. The numerator is the weight of the cans actually being melted down. So like Susan mentioned, CMI represents aluminum beverage can manufacturers and their suppliers. So we know how many cans we ship out, but the suppliers tell us how many cans they're melting down. So if it's being melted down, it's being recycled. If people want to learn more about our consumer recycling rate or the other KPIs that are on the slide here, that's in our 2019 Sustainability KPIs report that we put out with the Aluminum Association. You can find that with an easy Google search or on the Aluminum Association's website. So next slide, please. We have the highest recycling rate among beverage containers, but we at the same time have a crazy amount of aluminum beverage cans going to landfill. 45 billion cans a year in the United States, that's worth $800 million. That 45 billion, to put that into context, that's the equivalent of about 11 12 packs per person every year in the United States going to landfill. It just kind of boggles the mind. Next slide, please. So this we got from CRI. I must admit, Susan, I saw an updated one in your presentation, so I'll need to get my hands on that. But we know that one policy that is raising our recycling rate and keeping cans out of landfill is deposits. The data does not lie here. It's very clear. And one question I was asked to address in my presentation is if the aluminum recycling infrastructure could handle these kind of 80% rates for aluminum can recycling across all states, not just the 10 deposit states. And the reality is that the current aluminum recycling capacity in the United States is being utilized near its fullest extent. But many types of aluminum scrap are being processed in addition to the UBCs, the used beverage cans. Now, since UBCs are a preferred input versus some of those other scrap grades, the thinking is that there would be more UBCs consumed domestically or exported if the recycling rates of aluminum beverage cans spiked. But it would likely be at the expense of other grades of scrap. The upside, though, is that if we increase the availability of UBCs, that will provide more incentive for investments in growing and expanding aluminum recycling capacity, leading to higher rates of conversion of all aluminum scraps in the longer term. Now, what's that specific recycling rate? That's that inflection point where we'd see those investments? Hard to know, because there's many, many factors that would weigh into these investments, but know that the aluminum recycling industry feels confident that they could handle increased recycling rates. So next slide, please. This is more evidence of the impact on deposits. Susan mentioned that half of beverage containers come from these 10 states. What we say is that the 10 deposit states consume about 1/4 of all beverage cans, and they generate more than 1/3 of all cans recycled. It's probably closer to that half number, but we want to be a bit conservative. But same takeaway goes, that we get a lot of cans from these deposit states. Next slide, please. What's unique about cans is that they're processed at scale. And not only they're processed at scale, but they turn into something that is likely to be recycled at the end of its useful life. More than 95% of cans that are recycled are turned right into new cans. That's why we say that the can is the textbook example of the circular economy. Next slide, please. So this gives you a sense of our sales numbers. This is one of the reasons I was excited to join the can industry. It's a growing industry. We expect sales to further increase as consumers increasingly demand alternatives to plastic and as brands look for what packaging materials can help them meet their ambitious goals around recycling and recycled content and carbon. We recognize as a can industry that it's important that as these sales increase, in tandem with that, our recycling rate goes up. If they don't increase together, then we'll meet this increased demand, but with, to be honest, virgin aluminum. We'd prefer to make these additional cans out of old cans because recycling aluminum cans has significant benefits. If you go to the next slide, I can talk about those. So we know that there are significant energy savings in greenhouse gas emissions. More than 90% less energy is used and more than 90% less greenhouse gas emissions are produced when cans are made from recycled cans rather than virgin material. It's also the most valuable material in the recycling stream. Some of you might have seen the Recycling Partnership's State of Curbside Report, 2020 State of Curbside Report, and it found that of the material generated at single-family homes, aluminum cans make up 3% by weight of that material, but 44% of the revenue of that material. So it's really significant. And lastly, you've got, with aluminum cans, the aluminum within the cans, it can be recycled infinitely without any loss in quality. It's important to keep that out of landfill so we can have that aluminum be that textbook example of the circular economy. So next slide, please. This is our vision. Basically, it's saying that we want to build on our strength of having the leading recycling rate among beverage containers until we get to that 100% number. That's our aspirational future vision. Next slide, please. And if we're serious about that vision, we realized that we needed to have a more solutions-oriented approach to the policy, the deposit systems that have proven to get many of our cans back. We also recognize that there's an increasing amount of proposed bills to implement a deposit system or reform an existing one. The map you're seeing on your screen is the 13 states just since the start of 2020 that have such proposed bills. And this doesn't even include the federal bill for a national deposit system. Next slide, please. Clarissa mentioned in her presentation that the wall against deposits is crumbling. I have to admit that CMI is part of the rubble of that wall because we used to not be in favor of deposits. We lobbied against it. And that's the red part of that spectrum. And then on the bottom, you see when states, those 10 states, introduced their deposit systems. And then it started to get a bit more yellow recently, where we said that we were in favor of deposits where they currently exist. That, of course, invites the questions, well, what's your opinion about states that don't have deposits? And when I came in, along with the others on my staff, the Aluminum Association, my teammates, I should say, we wanted to put out a statement about where we stand, what we think leads to an efficient, effective deposit system. And that led to, next slide, an op-ed that we published in Resource Recycling just a couple weeks ago. And we start in the op-ed with the impact of recycling aluminum cans, how there's more legislative action on deposits lately, and how we get many cans back from deposit states. But we also say that not all deposit systems are the same. Some are more efficient and effective than others. And we go on in the article to detail 5 principles based on original research that our industry conducted and our decades of experience in recycling that we believe lead to an efficient, effective deposit system. So what are those 5 principles? Next slide. The first is differential pricing. This is saying that there should be some sort of price signal to consumers and beverage companies which materials are the most valuable and that the current recycling system can process at scale. We also strongly believe that there should not be pricing that creates market distortion based on packaging size. So an example there is a 2-liter bottle should not have the same deposit as a 12-ounce can. Another is that one nonprofit entity to manage the system, a brand-supported recycling organization, we feel would be the most efficient. The third is easy and convenient redemption. I'm sure we'll touch on this in the course of today, but we want the latest technology. We want many redemption locations so that people can easily return their containers and get the deposit they paid in. Fourth is including all beverage containers. This is out of fairness, and so there's not a perverse incentive created where consumers choose to buy a package that is not as valuable to the recycling system, and that today's recycling system cannot process at scale only because that consumer is thinking, well, I think I'd rather go with that package. I don't have to pay a deposit. So the 5th principle that we detail in this op-ed is that unredeemed deposits should be used to boost the recycling system. Keep the money focused on ensuring a functioning and efficient recycling system inside and outside of the deposit system. Unredeemed deposits should not be a slush fund for government for general expenses. People paid in as part of a recycling program, and it should go out as part of a recycling program if they're unredeemed. So I encourage people to read that op-ed, know that the can industry has a much more solutions-oriented approach to deposits, and I really appreciate the opportunity to share some of our thoughts with the attendees today. So thanks, Susan.
Scott, thank you so much. That was not only an amazing presentation, you also got us back on our time schedule. Thanks for catching us up. and you kind of did a news scoop here because it was just like in the last 10 days that your new policy announcement came out. So that's a good thing that we're able to have for everyone on this webinar.
Thanks, Susan.
So thank you. So next we're going to introduce another Scott, Scott DeFife. Scott DeFife became president of the Glass Packaging Institute in August of 2019 after serving as vice president of government affairs for the Plastics Industry Association, where he led the federal, state, and regulatory teams. And there's much more to his biography as well on the website. But to keep us on schedule, I'm going to turn it over to Scott. Welcome, Scott.
Thank you very much, Susan, and I hope to continue the streak of uninterrupted Wi-Fi and connectivity issues. We've been having a little bit of surges here in our building, so let me get going and see if I can do this quickly. So we'll just go through the next slide. First of all, we want to welcome CMI to the support for deposit systems state, my friend Scott Breen. Thankful to have him and CMI support for deposit systems. GPI has been long in support of bottle deposit systems across the country. The Glass Packaging Institute represents the glass container manufacturers here in North America. Right now we've got the 5 primary member manufacturing companies, and we represent the entire supply stream. You can see here the number of jobs in the United States and in North America for glass container manufacturers. And this 2018 data was approximately 27 billion glass containers manufactured in 2018. We also are working to update these statistics as the new ones roll out. But an interesting fact that people seem to forget, because I hear a lot about weight, is that glass bottles have also been reduced in weight over the course of the past several decades. And so trying to keep up with the rest of the packaging materials, obviously glass is still going to be heavier than aluminum and PET, but still doing our part to reduce weight. And I'm very happy to see the research presented earlier that shows some valuable gains from refillable glass bottles, so we can keep moving forward. The great thing about glass, and I hear it all the time, is consumers really want to recycle glass containers. It's one of the original packaging materials and one of the original recyclable materials. Obviously been around for quite some time. The GPI has actually been around for 100 years in North America in one form or another. And that long-standing belief that glass is a core recyclable has made it through from generation to generation, with over 90% of consumers and with jurisdictions reporting that their customers expect to recycle glass. Moving forward. Also, a key component of greenhouse gas reduction is the increased use of recycled glass in making new glass bottles and jars. And happy to also report that glass is, whenever you pick up a standard glass bottle or jar, it likely is already 1/3 recycled content, because with silica, limestone, and soda ash as the primary raw materials, recycled cullet, recycled glass is a key ingredient for most glass bottles and jars made in North America. Roughly around 1/3 right now of each package is recycled material. And that reduces greenhouse gas. Every increment more of recycled cullet, 10% more of recycled cullet that is used is reducing greenhouse gases by 1/3. So It is something that that the container manufacturers want more of, and we are embarking on an ambitious effort to try to get more of it and increase the numbers here in the United States. Because as you can see, I believe in the next slide, yes, my European slide, that we can just compare ourselves to the activity that's going on in Europe. Of course, we know that the waste management system here in the United States is very different, but it can be done. Glass recycling in Europe is at much higher rates, almost double the rates, if not more, than glass recycling in the United States, with your averages, ranging from country to country, everywhere from 67% to 93% glass recycling in the European Union, with bottle deposits and with bottle banks and a completely different way of recovering the material. GPI members had studied several years ago a way of getting to 50%, had increased the on average use of cullet from 25% to our current roughly 1/3. And I'm happy to report that we're embarking right now studying ways of getting us back on track to that 50% recycled content by 2030. Next slide. And as you've seen with several other maps, this is our map of glass recycling landscape and the production landscape in the United States. Of course, the red states are our bottle bill states. And you can see most of the green dots are our member companies, our locations. This is because we are starting this effort to map out the primary areas where we could focus on greater collection of glass to get it to our glass processing facilities and glass recycling facilities back into container manufacturing. A couple key statistics are that for glass containers, over 80% of the glass that gets made back into a glass bottle right now is coming from these 10 deposit states. But the markets for good quality glass are very strong. In many instances, that glass is moving across several state lines to get from point A to point B. So unfortunately, there's a strong narrative being put out by the waste management companies right now that there are quote unquote no markets for glass. Nothing could be further from the truth. There's very poor markets for low quality materials, very strong markets for high quality material. Next slide. And this is an example of there was another slide, I think it was either in Scott's or in an earlier presentation, but if you focus down in the lower right-hand corner of that 13% packaging block over on the lower right side, this is a map of glass in non-deposit states. So in non-deposit states, unfortunately, a good 43% of that is ending up in landfills, which is a waste of that material. Of course, they love the weight when they get to use it for daily cover, but otherwise, glass from non-deposit states, when you really get it down to the cullet reprocessors and the different opportunities for it, only about 13% of that material is making it back into a glass container. So over 80% of the material that is used from glass to glass bottle to bottle recycling is coming from the 10 deposit states, which is why we are so strongly in support of deposit programs. Next slide. Again, I've referenced this narrative that's going on out there about no markets for recycled glass. We're starting to push back, and every once in a while you can see a good storyline emerging, or people will realize that the information that they've been given about no markets for glass is faulty. In fact, we're really combating it in states where there's very strong markets right in their backyard. Akron, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Oklahoma. I've seen articles in the past month where one waste management company or another has claimed that there's no markets for glass when there are glass container processors and manufacturers in that state. So that's a big part of what we are undertaking right now, is to do some truth telling and correction in the media. Next slide. And as I said, we are targeting in on the markets. These circles that you see are not just graphics to make it look pretty. These are 100 and 250-mile radiuses from glass container plants, and we're embarking on a regional study to see where it is that we can focus our efforts from a legislative, policy, and regulatory perspective or market generation perspective to get more glass back to our glass plants. Next slide. In addition, in order to combat and tell the story about glass recycling, we have created a couple, in the past several years, created a couple additional organizations, the Glass Recycling Coalition. And I am so sorry, it looks like on this slide, it got greened out because it looks like it was it actually went to the link, but glassrecycles.org is the website for the Glass Recycling Coalition. So it looks like my green on green print there didn't work, Susan, but the glassrecycles.org is the website for the Glass Recycling Coalition, and the Glass Recycling Foundation is glassrecyclingfoundation.org. Those two websites have much more information about how different communities can participate and grow glass recycling in their area. Next slide. Here are the members of the Glass Recycling Coalition from this past year. You can see most of our manufacturers are a part, many of the brands and folks that are in the glass value chain are a part of the GRC. And next slide. One of the primary efforts, going back to that slide where we showed you how little of the glass from the non-deposit states is making it back into bottle-to-bottle, in addition to our work to help grow deposit programs across the country, we're also trying to help increase the quality of MRF glass, and a MRF certification program is one of the new initiatives of the GRC that has been rolling out. We have two from 2019, and our goal is to have 6 more MRF certified in 2020. Next slide. And the Glass Recycling Foundation was started last year. Actually, it was begun in 2018, but was certified as a 501c3 in 2019. And I took over as the new president of the GRF in the past couple of weeks. And we've taken in our first 2 donations from OI Foundation and from the Diageo Foundation, and we're going to be soliciting additional donations from third parties and foundations who want to work to improve glass recycling from a variety of different projects. It does not have to necessarily go to MRF projects, but whatever infrastructure we can help supply in order to create more glass recycling in communities. The GRF is capable of making grants and matching grants to help introduce and expand glass recycling. And next slide. And I had left some time for questions, but obviously since we're doing all this online, if you have any questions, please let me know and email me at estafif@gpi.org, or I'll take questions through Susan after the presentation is over. Thank you.
Scott, thank you so much. I had to unmute myself there. And thank you for leaving that time. We're just about at our time for break. I am going to see if I can improve my own a way of working with Zoom to get the questions in, because right now I can't do that. It is just about 10:30 Pacific time. So we're going to go ahead and do our 15-minute break. And just again, I want to say a huge thank you to all of the speakers we've had so far. Your presentations have all been fantastic, and you're really keeping us on time. And with that, we'll go into a 15-minute break right now.